So, up until now, we've largely been talking about cisgendered individuals, which hopefully you remember refers to people whose gender and sex match. Another way of saying that is who feel like they're living in the correct body. But there's a good percentage of people who don't feel that way, who are what we call transgender. Their sex and their body don't. Their sex and their sort of their mind and their body don't match. These are people who were assigned a certain sex at birth, but then uh, later on said that this isn't the way that I want to be defined. We call these individuals trans. And so I'm going to show you a couple videos talking about what we call breaking the binary or sort of moving away from this male and female dichotomy. I think I'm gonna skip that one, but I will play this one for you. Um, have you heard of pronouns? Right? Does anyone know what pronouns are? We often hear this in conversations about somebody might say, like, "Hi, I'm Dr. Swirsky. My pronouns are she, her, hers." And I get a question asked a lot about, well, why do we say that? Why do we identify our pronouns? People who are trans or people who are non-binary may not identify with traditionally gendered pronouns. For example, we tend to assume that men use he, him pronouns and women use she, her pronouns. Oftentimes that's true, but not always. It's just one more way of gendering people and often misgendering people. So it's really important to make sure that we're calling people by correct names and with correct pronouns. Just like my name is Jill. If somebody were to come up to me and call me Jen or Jess, I would say, that's not my name. And I would correct them and say, no, actually, it's Jill, and we'd move on. Same idea. Calling somebody by the wrong pronouns is it's can be harmful. It's unkind. It's just a form of disrespect. So let's learn a little bit more about pronouns and why they're important.
Just because I may present more femme doesn't mean that I'm any less they, them.
You know what, that thing where you're eating a meal but you're not really eating a meal, you're just kind of picking at food on the counter. My family and I were doing that one night, and I just kind of looked at them and said, "Hey guys, I'm non-binary. I don't have a gender."
In my opinion, gender is a universe. It is a broad spectrum of planets and stars and sky that truly cannot be contained into a binary.
My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and that's a non-negotiable. And they were all kind of like, okay.
I think one of the main reasons pronouns are so important is because other than our name, it's one of the main ways that people identify and call us.
My pronouns are personally very important to me. Growing up, enculturated into kind of a system that really subscribes to toxic masculinity, I was always uncomfortable with being called dude, what's up, man? I was so bad at dapping people up, like, how like guys like do that whole like that thing. I was so bad at that, and it just like I felt very alienated every time someone would do that to me.
So when someone identifies with a pronoun, they're essentially taking their little piece of that broad universe and identifying with that. And so in using their correct pronouns, we're validating that yes, you are right in your identity and you are important and we're respecting you.
Coming into terms with my gender queer identity has been one of the most challenging but also rewarding things that I've done.
Laverne Cox kind of famously said, misgendering a trans person is an act of violence. And it is. It's an act of psychological violence. It's a denial of somebody's personhood and a complete refusal to acknowledge their identity, whether intentional or not.
And so it is something that is entirely wrapped around our everyday lives. So just walking into a restaurant and hearing someone say she, will happen within 2 seconds of me entering, which doesn't happen about any of my other identities. They're not gonna be like, oh, you straight person, that doesn't happen. But automatically someone will make assumptions about gender which translate into pronouns, which mean that I will hear over and over again people saying something about my identity which is false.
I think a lot of people associate expression with identity, and sometimes that's not the case. Oftentimes I'm in situations where I'm not the most safe being able to express my gender identity, and in those cases, even in those instances where I'm wearing basketball shorts or sneakers, you can't take my gender identity away from me because that's mine and not yours.
So many different options for who you are and how to define that. So when someone chooses a personal pronoun that they identify with, using that pronoun is a form of respect and a form of validation that, yes, this is your rightful identity, and I will respect that.
And I know personally when I get misgendered, by strangers it's one thing, but it's especially painful when it's people who are close to you. So when my parents misgender me, it's a knife in my heart because they're the people whose opinions matter more to me than anybody else's.
And not knowing how to combat it. It is constant, and it is such a prevalent part of our society that being misgendered happens countless times in a day, and that builds up really quickly, and it can really be difficult for a person to hear over and over again because it invalidates your identity over and over and over again.
Pronouns are important because they are the smallest and easiest way that you can acknowledge somebody's identity.
And I also don't like that people call them their preferred pronouns because it's also not a preference. It's who they are. You need to use those pronouns. It's literally an extension of my arm or my leg. It's just as a part of me as a vital organ. My identity, although you can't see it, still needs to be validated just as much as you would validate the fact that I have 5 fingers or 5 toes.
And so hopefully that clears up some of the confusion about pronouns. I know that people often find this conversation really confusing. A question that I get a lot is, well, how do you know what pronoun somebody uses? And that's a really good question. My response would be, well, how do you know what somebody's name is? Somebody you've never met before. What would you do? Probably ask them, right? And that wouldn't be considered odd or uncomfortable or strange in any way. That's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. Pronouns are no different to asking somebody, what pronouns do you prefer? Another way to do that, if that feels too direct, is by sharing your pronouns, because that opens a space where the other person can feel comfortable to do so as well. If you're not sure, don't guess. That's probably the best advice I can give you. Or if you're looking to make a very, very small change as a result of everything that you've learned this week, that would be my advice. Don't make assumptions. When in doubt, ask or just assume gender neutral pronouns. They and them is always a safe bet. I asked you all to watch Growing Up Trans. I hope you did. It's one of my favorite documentaries to show in class because it's just so powerful. If you didn't watch it, you still have time to do so. But the gist is that it follows a bunch of teenagers who are trans, and it talks about some of the challenges they face, the controversies they face, the mental health issues they face. Many of the adolescents that we heard from in the video in the documentary talked about how living in the wrong body hurts. It feels wrong. It feels like you want to shed your skin like a lizard, right? They talk about like really kind of graphic depictions of how uncomfortable this is for them. One of the kids talked about how one of the trans males talked about how the idea of growing breasts at puberty is absolutely horrifying to them. You heard statements about things like, I would rather die than grow breasts. I would rather die than start to look like a woman or look like a man. That's really scary. And that's really important to think about. We're talking about the mental health of children and adolescents. And so a commonly asked question is, well, why should we be listening to kids? They don't know what they're talking about. That's a phase. They'll grow out of it. As adults, it's our job not to push things on them. I would agree with that. I would also argue, though, that we do push gender on kids, whether or not we intend to, for all of the reasons we've already talked about. So letting children express their identities is not only a typical part of adolescent development, but it's a safe place for adolescents and kids to sort of express who they are. And it's a way to help protect mental health and let people live their more authentic lives. And yet gender transitioning is super, super controversial for a lot of reasons. It's deeply tied up with politics and religion, which always makes things a bit more controversial. But I also suspect that a lot of it just comes down to lack of understanding. People don't really understand what it means to be trans, what it means to transition. And so I'm gonna do this out of order. I'm gonna talk a little bit about something called gender affirming care. You may have heard about this. It's actually been in the media quite a bit lately. Gender affirming care refers to It's really just a supportive form of healthcare. It's an array of services. It includes things that are medical, surgical, mental health, non-medical services for people who are trans or non-binary. Early gender affirming care is just as critical to overall health and well-being as seeing a medical doctor. It allows the child or the adolescent to focus on being their authentic selves and increasing their confidence. Here's the thing that a lot of people don't tend to understand, and so I think this is a really important distinction. There's a huge spectrum of transitioning. When we think about trans individuals or the transition process from one sex to a different sex, or one gender to a different gender, we often think of surgery. Okay, so people either having breasts added or removed, of having vaginas added or removed, penises added or removed. Does that happen? Absolutely. Surgical, gender affirming surgery is absolutely a viable option, for people who are trans, but it's a pretty extreme option. And so I like this chart because it shows some of the less invasive options. There's social affirming, okay, social transitioning. This is as simple as changing your pronouns, maybe changing your hair, makeup, and how you present yourself. It is completely non-invasive and it's 100% reversible. Oftentimes, trans individuals will engage in social transitioning. Not necessarily a surgical intervention. So the concern often for children and adolescents is, well, they shouldn't be having surgery. You can take whatever stance you'd like on that. But I would argue that many times they're not. Many times we're not talking about surgery or anything medically invasive. We're just talking about the way that we're presenting ourselves. There's also puberty blockers, which were talked about quite a bit in growing up trans. Puberty blockers are exactly what they sound like. They're hormones that sort of hits a pause button on puberty. What it does is it buys time. Okay. So think about it. When you're, for girls, we start to enter puberty around 10 or 11. At that point, that's when breasts start to develop. For a trans person who doesn't feel they identify with being a woman, who does feel they identify with being in a man's body, growing breasts can be really stressful. And so puberty blockers can sort of hit a pause button on that and give more time to explore options. It can be a really good strategy for just sort of giving time, pausing the clock to let the individual and their family sort of think through the process. Moving upward, and that's also puberty blockers are also reversible. So when they stop taking the puberty blockers, puberty will begin. Then there's hormone therapy. So this is a bit more invasive, right? We're sort of moving up on the ladder. Hormone therapy involves taking testosterone or taking estrogen, okay, to and that will result in some bodily changes. So people who were assigned female at birth, if they take testosterone, it will deepen their voice a bit. It may slow breast development. It may cause facial hair to grow. Estrogen hormones may make the voice rise, may make breasts begin to develop, all sorts of things like that. This is partially reversible. So if you stop taking the hormones or if you start taking other hormones, some of these changes can reverse, but it's not going to be complete. And then the most invasive is what we call surgery, gender affirming surgery. We see either top surgery, which is exactly what it sounds like, it involves the breasts, or bottom surgery, which is genital surgery. This is not super common. We're not, just to be clear, the argument isn't that we should be sending kids and adolescents out to get top and bottom surgery. The issue with gender affirming care is, should we be supporting all humans in the gender that they want to be in? So now I am going to go back and show you this video about gender affirming care.
Hi, I'm Lilo Staten. I cover healthcare for NJ Spotlight News. This is Avery, who's trans and helps people navigate gender affirming healthcare services.
My name is Avery Hyman. I use they, them pronouns. I am patient navigator for gender affirming care at Planned Parenthood Metropolitan New Jersey. So my transition journey was not necessarily a linear one, and that's one point that I like to make with people that are asking about transitioning, because transitioning can be a whole set of things. It can be medical, it can be social, it can be legal. So technically, if we're going as far back thinking about when I first started transitioning, I could say always, my entire life. It's when I decided I didn't want to wear girls' clothes, or I wanted to be affirmed in different ways. But if we are talking medical transitioning, that I did in 2019 with testosterone microdosing for about 6 months. And that was a decision I decided to make because at that time I was working with the Babs Sipperstein Proud Center, who also offered gender affirming care. So I figured, why not? I'm here, let's get the ball rolling. To me, gender affirming care is healthcare. It can be anything from a cancer screening to a gynecological appointment to a echocardiogram. Anything that has to do with your body that is given to you in a way that affirms your gender, where you're being used with, you're given the right pronouns, gender affirming name, all those types of things can be gender affirming care. Broadly speaking, gender affirming care, when most people think of it, it also involves things like hormones, regular lab testing to make sure that everything is in order with your levels, gender affirming surgeries, those types of things.
So you may have heard about what's sort of colloquially called the Don't Say Gay law, but the technical terminology is the Parental Rights Education Bill. And so this passed in Florida on March 28th, 2022. Okay, so you'll often hear this called the Don't Say Gay law. What this bill does is it prohibits classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity before the 4th grade. So what that means is that teachers cannot talk to their classes about gender or sexual orientation. It requires that all instruction be age appropriate or developmentally appropriate thereafter. Now, I would argue that those are sort of broad terms. And so you can sort of form your own opinion about whether or not this is correct, but I would ask you to think about some of the implications, one way or the other. A lot of people are concerned that the bill will result in restricted or non-existent education about the existence of diverse sexual and gender identities, but can also make a hostile climate for LGBTQ educators, students, and families. Because what it does is it suggests that there's something wrong, there's something shameful that we shouldn't be talking about. And so a lot of people and a lot of critics will say, well, we shouldn't be pushing this information on children. I hear that. And again, I would make the argument that we push gender on children in all sorts of ways. And so how is this any different? But come to your own conclusion. The other question I would ask you to think about is, well, how do we define what's age appropriate? Is there a universal age at which we can or should be having these conversations? Why are we so scared of teaching kids about gender and sexual diversity? What do we think is going to happen, right? And so those are the questions that I hope you'll think about, and I hope you'll talk about with your friends and your family, because that's what helps propel these conversations forward. And finally, I have one last video that talks about the benefits of using gender inclusive terms for children.
Hey friends, it's not uncommon for children's activities to be advertised as being for boys and girls, or to hear a teacher shout, "Okay, boys and girls, line up!" Using binary gender to categorize kids isn't harmless and can actually contribute to sexist attitudes and feelings of exclusion among children. I'm Dr. Kyle, and I'm sharing 3 reasons for expanding beyond boys and girls by using gender-neutral and inclusive terms. Reason number 1. The phrase boys and girls signifies gender as a binary and exceptional point of difference among kids. When children are made to think of themselves according to which group they belong to, such as race or class or gender, they're more likely to develop bias against children who are not in their group. Research shows that when teachers use gendered language and categories to organize their classrooms, young students show more gender stereotyping and rejection of different gender peers compared to students in classrooms where gender isn't an explicit category. Replacing the phrase boys and girls with a term like friends or learners can help children avoid developing sexist attitudes and increase the likelihood that they'll play in mixed gender groups. That's a good thing. Reason number 2. Many children don't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, and hearing the phrase boys and girls can make some children feel invisible and like they don't belong. There are transgender, non-binary, and gender fluid kids, and intersex children, and the call to line up in the boy line or the girl line can feel distressing. For example, a transgender girl may feel uncomfortable choosing the girl line if her teacher or her classmates aren't aware of her transition yet and may say something to her like, "You're in the wrong line." Children thrive in environments where they feel seen, loved, and supported. Grown-ups can choose language and behavior that holds affirming space for kids who are between and beyond the gender binary. If forming lines is absolutely necessary, get creative. January through June birthdays here, and July through December birthdays here. Reason number 3. Language is a powerful force, and children learn about the world through the words they are taught. Gendered language can influence gender bias about who does what. More often than not, boys and men get preferential treatment and power in the English language. Mankind, gingerbread man, mixed gender groups addressed as guys, fireman, mailman, congressman. Girls and non-binary people don't get as much representation in language, which implies they aren't as important. Studies have found that the use of gender-neutral language reduces gender bias and leads to more favorable attitudes towards cisgender women and queer and transgender people. Ousting boys and girls and the grown-up equivalent ladies and gentlemen from your vocabulary is an easy way to commit to everyday anti-sexist action and celebrate gender diversity. Here's a few replacements to get you started. Kiddos, scholars, buddies, esteemed guests, vessels of stardust, little cuties, crew, folks, athletes, innovators, artists, adventurers. I'd love it if you'd like this video.
I think she does a really great job of discussing some of the reasons why gender inclusive terminology can be helpful, but also of showing how easy it can be. A major pushback tends to be people saying, well, this is going to be hard. This is going to be a cognitive challenge for me. But is it really? Does it have to be? I would argue that it doesn't. So I challenge you as we have these conversations and as we move through this week's content to think about some small changes that you might make in your life to help be more inclusive or to help make safer spaces for people who maybe don't fit the gender binary as much as we might think they do. I'll see you next time.